Welcome to this week's episode of the Marketing Show. We're really happy to have Armand Brevig with us today, a procurement and sales leader who helps B2B salespeople deal more effectively with procurement departments. He's also a karate enthusiast, and that might come in handy as well as we're dealing with procurement people. Anyway, welcome to the show, Armand. We're pleased to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Melissa. It's such an honor to be on the show.
Awesome.
Hey, it's good to have somebody from Nottingham finally on the show here. We've been trying, and thank you for responding. Hey, Armand, you and I connected through LinkedIn, and you as a seasoned procurement guy, you flipped around the desk now, and you're coaching salespeople to sell the procurement. And a lot of our audiences we talked about off camera, are into the technology space, and you've actually got experience procuring for organizations, buying professional services, IT services. And I'm curious, as we talk today, I think as a seller, often we think of procurement as, we have different words to describe procurement at times, but not always the friendliest. And they try to, commoditize everything in an RFP. But anyway, we'll get into that today because I think you've got some really good ideas to unlock that perception and improve win rates, which is if you're listening or watching today, what we're going to try and do. So Melissa, what was the first question you're going to ask Armand there?
Well, I think if you're a B2B salesperson listening, you might be thinking procurement. That seems like a lengthy and painful process. However, Armand's going to help us approach that differently, I hope, Armand. So why should salespeople care about their prospects' procurement departments, and why can't we just avoid them?
Basically, because something has happened over the past 2 decades when it comes to procurement. Procurement has become more and more empowered by senior management within large and mid-sized companies. And therefore, they also get involved in more and more spend areas that they perhaps before wasn't so involved in or couldn't touch at all. So because of that, procurement is now part of the decision-making unit. And because they're part of the decision-making unit, it becomes more difficult and riskier to actually avoid them. So a much better approach then is to actually develop a strategy, a targeted strategy for how you as a salesperson are going to deal with procurement. Because if you don't have that targeted strategy, then essentially you are not responding to an environment that's slowly been changing over time and continues to change. And there's no sign of that trend lessening. Quite the opposite, particularly given the economic hardship that a lot of companies are feeling at the moment. There's a tendency to empower procurement even more. So if you ignore that as a salesperson, it's a little bit like the analogy with the boiling frog. You take a frog, put it in a pot of cold water, you slowly heat that water up, and you expect the frog to jump out. But of course, the frog doesn't jump out because it doesn't realize that the environment is changing very slowly. And something similar to that is definitely something that you'd want to avoid as a salesperson. And that is essentially why it's important to take an interest in procurement from a sales perspective.
So Brevig is okay. So I'm the sales DNA guy on the program here. So we would coach a lot of times salespeople to call or at least enter an account or try and secure relationships above procurement, right? Because we want to influence the deal. We want to get the key decision makers, understand their business objectives, link our solution to that, and then skew the buying criteria, so the procurement really has no option other than to go with us. I mean, in layman terms. So as you say, avoiding procurement, I'm curious, a lot of sales strategies, coach what I said, go high, then come down to procurement, as opposed to start at procurement and then try and, foster a relationship there. Do you have any comments on that? Go high first, then down to procurement, or procurement up kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends. It's not bad advice at all, actually. And I would say in many situations that makes perfect sense. So the timing of when you interact with procurement, if if what you sell actually is something that lends itself to procurement, to procurement's agenda, in the sense that it will help procurement perform their task better, then it would make sense to sort of lead with, or at least approach procurement at the same time that you would approach the economic buyer or whatever stakeholder you want to pursue, because then procurement would be particularly interested in talking to you. If, on the other hand, you're talking about something that does not necessarily align very closely to procurement's agenda, and when I say that, I mean something that can take costs out of the system. I'm not necessarily talking about lower price, but something that can take cost out of the system, or something that can simplify the supply chain, or help consolidate the supplier base. If that's the case, then procurement can actually become your ally, and then it makes sense to actually reach out to them at the same time. But whatever benefits your product or service then delivers that's of relevance to procurement must be tangible in terms of sort of a dollar amount that procurement can claim as being a benefit that they have helped deliver into the organization. Now, if it's not possible to express the benefit that you deliver in that tangible dollar amount, then I would definitely say, as you said there, you go to the economic buyer first, and then later you ask for an introduction to procurement. But what I think many salespeople don't do, they don't ask for that introduction. Mm-hmm. So at some point you do need to ask for that introduction. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have to be the first thing that you do. But if you don't do it, then you will most likely find that procurement will put more spanners in the wheel than otherwise would have been the case, and you will have a longer sales cycle, for example.
One piggyback question. So you mentioned to try and link in layman terms, quantify the business impact, if possible, that would benefit procurement. What have you found is kind of the common compensation model for procurement these days? Are they bonused by savings? Is it a salary-based normal thing, and we just hope that they chisel away at the cost, capital or operating? Like, how are they paid, in short?
Procurement people do get bonuses, but it's nothing comparable in size to the commissions that salespeople get.
Okay.
So their incentive is it's not so much the bonus, because if they do really, really well, and this is at the extreme end of bonuses, they could get 20%. More likely it's like 10%, something like that.
I asked because when I was on contract as a consultant for Ingram Micro, a large tech distributor in North America and globally, actually, I was hired by GE to go in and coach all of their procurement department how to negotiate against salespeople. And it's really, because they, in their helmet, they think like a buyer. And I was in saying, okay, here's how they form on the other line of the scrimmage. And really, you're doing a great job of that, I think, coaching salespeople, the mindset, the priorities, what a procurement person thinks like. And that's why I asked, sorry, about the compensation. The ugly thing for us as sellers is that thing you guys came up with called an RFP. You ever heard of that one? Talk about a karate chop for salespeople. I'd be interested in your coaching on RFPs in general. And for those of us that have, been served up an RFP, great, huge opportunity, but it almost seems like the procurement team spent time strategizing how to commoditize, line item everything, really to come up with an uncommon denominator called, the cost. And I'd be curious as to your coaching on how salespeople should position themselves to influence the criteria, really win the deal.
Yeah, I mean, the thing with RFPs is that it's of course a lot easier to influence the requirement if you get in there before the RFP is actually sent out. So if you can. And I mean, there are different ways of doing that. It can be, part of your ordinary sales outreach. You may choose to, lead with a service, a product that flies under the RFP radar. Because if you have something that you can sell, whether it's an initial feasibility study or whatever it is, that's less than about $50,000 US, you're not gonna be faced with an RFP. Because it's simply not worth the time and effort of a large company to run that whole expensive and time consuming. I mean, it looks time consuming from the salesperson's view, and it is, but it's equally time consuming from the buying organization's point of view to run these processes. So one strategy, or one part of a strategy, could be to get in there with an offer that doesn't attract an RFP, and then when the follow-on project comes, of course, you are in a good position to then influence the requirement and perhaps gain some information about the organization that your competitors wouldn't necessarily have. But I think it's absolutely key to have a strategy for how you're going to improve your RFP win rates, because when procurement sends out RFPs, it may look like it's just something they do and it's just part of a process, but which it is, but it's also part of a strategy in many cases, particularly if you're talking about more sophisticated procurement organizations. So it is part of their overall sourcing strategies. They've already decided how are they going to use RFPs to manage a particular category of spend. So it stands to reason that salespeople or sales teams also need a strategy for how they're going to win as much business as possible through that route, and how they are going to dramatically increase the win rate and make the whole game worthwhile.
So I agree with get in early, try and influence, or better yet, understand, the environment. And I liked your point about understanding the threshold of an RFP value. So in a large account, you mentioned 50,000 US for a feasibility study. In smaller accounts, it may be 25,000 or 10,000 or whatever. But I think that's an important point you mentioned there. What if you're not, let's say, the incumbent that typically has the inside lane and gets the right of access to the needs analysis or whatever you want to call it, and you're served the RFP that's already been cooked by a competitor that's the incumbent, and you're trying to be disruptive? May I ask, what you've seen as tactics that maybe have proved successful if you haven't had the chance to shape the RFP?
The last thing a procurement team wants to do is to reissue an RFP. It's seen as embarrassing, and a lot of questions are going to be asked internally in the organization, but that's exactly what you want to try to get them to do if you're in that situation that you described there. It really hinges on whether you can convince them that they'll miss something. So miss something that's so fundamental and serious that if they go ahead with that RFP, it would be wasted effort anyway. Then you might have an 11th hour opportunity to influence the new RFP that's sent out. Now, of course, procurement people are very sensitive towards being influenced by vendors, because there can be quite some skepticism from salespeople towards procurement people, but it goes the other way as well. So,
oh, really?
It is bizarre in a way, because a business needs both to really work. But I guess that's how it's evolved over time. So if you as a salesperson can get the economic buyer to make the point to procurement that the way that this RFP is put together is flawed, and could we reissue it? That would be even more powerful. But then that of course requires you to have that relationship with the economic buyer. But I mean, regardless of whether you can do that or not, the key is to convince procurement that it would be an utter waste of time to run that process. You've got some a better information that they need in order to run a new and improved RFP, if you will.
On the sales side, we spend a lot of time. Well, we're a sales training company. You yourself are coaching sales teams to sell to procurement. What type of training does a procurement person get to prepare themselves for the sales entity? We'll call it. You know what I mean? one time I was on a sales call with a sales rep, and we came out of the call, and the rep said, "Oh, the call went great," but I was observing really what the guy on the other side of the desk, the procurement guy, was doing, and I looked over his shoulder. I said to the rep after, "Did you see what the guy had on his bookshelf?" And it was like negotiating 1, negotiating 2, and then masterclass negotiating. Like he had the binders right behind his shoulder.
Yeah.
And this guy had just taken the rep for a ride. Anyway, the rep had no idea, but I think sometimes as salespeople, we underestimate the training and strategy that you reference on the procurement side, the same way as the sales team would strategize and map out and do all those things. Is that fair to say that they're being trained as well for that line of scrimmage, as I call it?
That is extremely fair to say. I mean, I have worked for a leading global pharmaceutical company for many years. I have never been received as much training as I did as a procurement professional there. One thing that procurement people, one way that they perceive themselves, sort of their raison d'être, is really to negotiate. So that is one thing they take a lot of pride in. So they will know all the negotiation tactics and techniques and how to strategize around that. And I think it's also worth pointing out that if you look at sort of formal graduate programs, they actually exist within the procurement space. I do not believe they exist within the sales space. Or in very few universities. So
what's funny, sorry, is in my experience, I would argue that less than 5% of business-to-business so-called sales professionals have had any negotiating training whatsoever, and yet 80% of them typically have some variable component to their compensation that's driven by profit, called gross profit, et cetera. And so I just, having worked in an organization that I was working with procurement people down a couple flights, you'd work with the salespeople. I think it's really naive of salespeople not to think that people in your previous position are being schooled on really how to protect the interests of their company, their employer. And so, you use a 4%, I think it was, Melissa, success rate on RFPs, Armand. Like, why is it so low?
Well, I mean, it's an average. So there are lots of companies that get even lower success rates, and companies that get a lot higher success rates. So it's very unevenly distributed. And I'm saying this sort of from anecdotal evidence. I haven't actually seen any studies of how it's distributed, but that's my experience. That's what I see. I think it's so low because most salespeople don't have a strategy for how to actually deal with these RFPs. So what they do, they get an invitation to respond to an RFP. They think that's a good fit. And then they respond to basically any RFP.
Yeah.
That they could reasonably respond to.
Yeah.
And if you do that, then you're not going to be particularly successful. You could argue that perhaps there is a 10% chance of winning because very few procurement organizations would put more than 10 vendors through through the process. But we all know it also depends who's been able to influence this and things like that. So so the reason why the percentage is so low, I think, if I were to pin it down to one single thing, it would be lack of strategy.
It is hard on the sales side, I'll tell you, because it's pretty much a bunch of boxes. You got to fill in your variables. There's a little bit of qualitative stuff on why your company history, but as far as delivering a value proposition or differentiation, I found the RFPs we've done, it's very vanilla and, intentionally set up that way. So I like what you've said today about, really what's around the RFP, the economic stakeholder, engaging really what I think you too would coach, and we coach is, high, wide, and deep in the organization, get in there before the RFP. Sorry, Melissa, you were going to ask a question?
Yeah, I was. You spoke a lot about a strategy. So as we wrap up today, what would you give a sales rep, given what 3 ways to engage a procurement person given their growing power and influence, right? Like, what are those three things that they could add to their strategy?
Give us the silver bullets.
Exactly. So I'm
Yeah.
listening, I'm thinking, okay, I got to have a strategy, but what are those top 3 things that I maybe should do if I'm a B2B salesperson?
Well, in terms of engaging with procurement, I think there are 3 things that I can think of that you definitely need to consider. So one of them we already touched on, and that is the timing of it. When do you actually reach out? And as I mentioned before, it really depends on whose agenda your offering is most closely connected with. The second thing is insights about procurement. I mean, I think it's no different from any other stakeholder. The more you know about them, the more likely you are to be able to influence them. So you need to understand things like, what are the paradigms that they believe in procurement? You know, what makes them tick? How are they? How are they rewarded? Like we touched a bit upon with the bonuses, but there's more to that piece as well. And then I would say the third thing to be very mindful of in terms of engaging with procurement is flexibility. So I mentioned at the very beginning of our conversation that procurement has been and is on this journey to become more and more empowered, so to speak, and they have gone from being this very old school transactional function to becoming much more of a strategic business partner, if you will. But those are just 2 extreme ends of the spectrum. Different procurement teams are at different points in that journey. So you also need to understand that you can't treat in terms of the way you engage with them. There are conversations that you can have with a truly strategic procurement team, which you cannot have with an old school transactional procurement team.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Things are advancing. I mean, technology is giving visibility, giving accountability, all kinds of great things for procurement. The big mistake too I see salespeople make is they bank too much on a personal relationship and not a business relationship. You know what I'm saying there? Like, we've done business with XYZ for years, and I know these guys, and I think your point today about the rising influence, we'll call it, or power of procurement, I think is very valid. And we're seeing it, the decision makers, we'll call it, above the procurement rung are often trying to separate themselves from the decision because they don't want to, create a rat's nest for their procurement people by influencing or steering. And I think procurement's a little bit of a misunderstood entity by a lot of salespeople, and really appreciate you coming in today and shedding some light on how that department works and how to unlock that key today.
Yeah, great insights, Armand. Thank you. So as we wrap up today, Armand, if someone wants to reach out to you for some coaching, how do they get a hold of you?
Well, the easiest way is to find me on LinkedIn, and I am extremely easy to find because I'm the only Armand Brevig on LinkedIn. So all you have to do is be able to remember my name. You'll be able to find me.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being with us today, and we look forward to seeing everyone again next week on This Marketing Show.
Good job today, buddy. Thanks for joining us.
You're welcome. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of This Marketing Show. If you enjoyed today's show, please like, share, and subscribe to get the latest B2B insights to help you market and sell to win.